general, you'll never have enough security engineers. You'll never have a big enough security team, right? I mean, it's the nature of the beast. It is a cost center. When times are good, I'm sure you'll have enough security teams. When times are not good, you'll have to do with less, right? So it's always good to think about how you can kind of leverage non-security teams as force multipliers.
Hello, and welcome to the Modern Security Podcast, where we interview security leaders and share their lessons learned in building highly scalable security programs. I'm your host, Clint Gibler, Head of Security Research at SemGrep and creator of TLDRSec, a free newsletter where you can easily keep up with the latest in security research in just 7 minutes a week. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Sandesh. Welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Clint.
So Sandesh spent many years as a consultant at Seezo. Then he was head of security at Razorpay, and now is the founder and CEO of an AI-first application security startup called Seezo, which we will get into in a moment. So the structure of this is we're going to first go through a number of sort of big picture and tactical lessons learned in scaling security programs. And then at the end, we're going to talk about Sandesh's vision for how AI can help scale application security in the future. So yeah, let's get right into it. So first, could you tell us a little bit about Razorpay, the company, and when you joined, what the state of the company was?
Yeah, so Razorpay is a B2B fintech company. It's India's largest payment gateway, among other things. And I joined them 3 to 4 years ago, and I was kind of the first full-time security hire. They already had a security team. They already had a small security team which did compliance and pen testing, etc. But I was kind of brought in to build the security program. The charter was kind of to make security the first-class citizen, right, at Razorpay. And I thought that was very exciting because before that, I kind of spent 10 years, close to 10 years at Seezo, which is an application security company. And what was interesting there was I got to work with many different AppSec programs, across industries, across geographies. I started out in the US, but then spent a lot of time in Asia, in Hong Kong, Singapore, India, etc. Right? So I've seen a lot of different application security programs. But for me, what was exciting about coming into Razorpay was kind of digging deeper into one particular company, right? And kind of trying to help build the security program. So that was really exciting. And kind of the way I started off was, again, consulting background. So you like talking to people, you can like interviewing people. So one of the first things I did was, spoke to a bunch of engineering stakeholders. I don't remember the exact number. It was a while ago, but it was close to 30. And then asked them the same 3 or 4 questions, right? Like, what's working well, what's not working well, and if I could do one thing to improve security, then what would that be, right? And what was surprising that we kind of got similar answers from everyone. So like 60% of the answers were the same across the board, and there were some obvious changes everywhere, right? So what that gave me is that I walked in with certain hypotheses on what would be best to how to get started. But when I spoke to them, I kind of realized that there are certain things which are absolute low hanging fruits, which will really help help our stakeholders get confidence in us, right? Because and give them an impression that we're listening to them. So based on that fabulous feedback, we got started, and then we took some low hanging fruits, executed them, and that kind of got the ball rolling. So I spent about 3 years at Razorpay, helping build the security team, focused on AppSec, cloud security, and security operations, and had a ball overall.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. One thing I really like about what you shared is, so you just joined Razorpay, and then basically the first thing was essentially doing a bunch of customer interviews. One thing that I hear people who I would view are sort of like thinking about security from very like a modern progressive way is they think of the security team as almost like a very service-oriented team in terms of like the engineers are our customers. It's our job to help the business move as quickly and as effectively as possible at an acceptable level of risk. So I think it's like canonical, like obvious if you're like building a product to be like, well, yeah, you talk to the users and are like, what should I build for you? So I thought it was super cool that you're like, yeah, the first thing is I just talked with a bunch of engineering leaders and was like, yeah, what are your pain points? What are your friction things? And I'm sure that was very helpful in later things you did in terms of they're like, oh, this guy knows about our problems. He cares about solving them. He's already maybe solved a few of them. He's made my life better, which probably gave you some nice social capital if you needed to do specific things that maybe were short-term friction for them in the future.
Yeah, no, I think what you said is largely true, right? So you have to look at engineering teams and other stakeholders as customers. But what makes it challenging is that they're not really customers, right? I mean, of course, you got to treat them that way. But in the middle of the incident, they're not your customers, right? At that point, you got to kind of put your foot down and not worry about enabling people and just get shit done, right? So I think what was interesting for me was that I think you kind of need to have like different almost different wartime behavior and peacetime behavior. There are certain aspects of security where I think you got to be consultative, you got to treat your stakeholders as customers, you got to enable them to move faster. But there are times where you cannot afford to do that. You got to put your foot down, right, and kind of enforce behavior, right? And I think as a consultant, it was hard for me to do the latter, right? The former, being consultative, treating them as customers, came very naturally to me. But there were definitely moments where we had to do the other way around, and that was hard. And that was something I had to learn over time, right? Responding to audits, incident response, dealing with tough stakeholders who really want to push security as late as possible. So those were actually quite hard, right? But you're right. I think by and large, you want to work, in good faith with your stakeholders, treat them as customers, and enable them. But when you got to switch gears, you got to have the ability to do it, and that's what makes security challenging and fun at the same time.
Totally. And I think we might talk through a couple of examples of both of those in this discussion. So going along with the sort of consultative approach, could you give some examples of some secure defaults or secure guardrails or initiatives that helped eliminate maybe classes of issues by construction?
Yeah. So I think we were, like I said, I've seen this happen in multiple companies, but I can give you an example of what happened at Razorpay here, right? So I think one of the advantages when working with Razorpay is that we had a very small security team, but a large development organization, right? So we obviously, there was no way we could do everything, right? So we had to pick and choose what are the best things to do in the beginning as we scaled the program, right? And one of the things we felt were very valuable was there was a platform team in Razorpay. We did a lot of platform engineering stuff, and they had a whole. I think there's a blog post about this as well. They had they were moving towards a microservices architecture, and every time you wanted to build a new microservice, there was like a repo which allowed you to, if you just clone the repo, you get the shell of all the basic things needed to build a new microservice, right? There's called Go Foundation. Now the advantage is when you have something like that, that kind of clicked my mind of saying, hey, this is the best place to put in security defaults, right? So if you can overload some of those methods there. So one of the early things we did was, hey, we partnered with the platform team, right? And when we did that, we said, hey, I know these are the 7 things that you're doing. How do we make these secure by default, right? And in such a way that it's really hard to implement this insecurely. So let me give you an example, right? So they obviously had some functions for logging, right? Now, can we overload the logging functions to see if it can do a grep search of some kind, detect if there's a PII in what you're logging? Because developers tend to log the entire request sometimes, and that might actually have PII. So if you have like some kind of regex to detect PII, and if it detects PII, then go ahead and mask it. And if that happens by default, then developers don't have to think about, hey, what am I logging? Should I be masking it? Should I be truncating, etc. Right? So that complexity kind of goes away, right? So that was something we were able to do, which kind of really helped. And this can be done, in any company, right? So logging, encryption, random number generation, these are really good examples. And then there may be things which is very specific to your company, right? So for instance, if you're, if you're an API first type company, then rate limiting kind of becomes really important. So if you can bake rate limiting in when you onboard your API to the API gateway, so by default, there are some rate limiting things set, or depending on other parameters, like is it an external API, is it an internal API, is it talking to customers, etc. If you can set default rate limiting structures, then the odds of some kind of an attack goes down dramatically, right? So I think some of those things really helped us. We weren't able to implement all of them on day one, but I think what the way it worked, initially we had a hard time kind of convincing them to write some of these things, but as they realized that many classes of SAST vulnerabilities would go away when they do this, that was like a really good motivation for them to not just write these libraries, but also help adopt them, right? Because writing and publishing them is one thing, but having developers actually use them regularly is a whole other ballgame, and that takes like actually much longer, right? So this was kind of at a high level how we thought about security defaults.
Nice. Yeah, I love those examples. And I guess if you think of the mission of the platform engineering team being to enable other engineering teams to write better, higher quality software faster, and they can observe like, well, we tend to have this many defects per 1,000 PRs of these types, and it takes us this much time to fix it, and it's, we have to budget that into sprints. It's like, well, if we could make those go away, we would be fulfilling our charter as the platform engineering team of like making software development faster, because there's things that used to happen that you don't have to fix now. So you're like, cool, like it's still directly aligned with their charter, actually.
Yeah, one of the things I learned, again, like I said, by the way, before that job, I wasn't. I mean, I've never been a full-time developer for too long. I've written code. I've worked as a developer for a few years at the beginning of my career, so I didn't really understand dev culture that well. But what I learned when I worked very closely with developers is that they really care about dev productivity, right? Like a 5% improvement here means a lot to them, right? I don't always agree that it has a big impact. Sometimes maybe it does, sometimes it doesn't. But hey, if they feel that they have a great impact, and as enablers, it's our job to help them do that, right? So tying that to their PR review timelines metrics and software velocity metrics, etc., really gives them a high, right? So if you can figure out what is it that they really care about and kind of tie in security to those metrics, it usually makes it a lot easier to get things adopted.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think we're going to go a little bit in more detail into tying it to business objectives in a second. Yeah. But before we do that, one thing that you mentioned when we were chatting before this discussion is the effectiveness of leveraging non-security teams for some security initiatives. So yeah, I was wondering, could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the things I learned, when I did consulting is, I always give this example that, as a tech person, you usually sort of kind of, don't pay too much attention to teams like sales, right? But when I had to work very closely with the sales team at Digital /Synopsys, right, I actually found that a lot of the problems we face in the security world is also faced by a non-technical team like sales, which was kind of surprising. Like, why would it be similar, right? So, for instance, one of the things that really good salespeople do is that they don't sell your product per se, but they kind of try to understand what the problem the customer is and kind of try to articulate how the customer can solve their product problem and where the product fits in, right? So, in general, I think communicating well with other teams, leveraging other teams is a skill that I saw in action when I was in consulting, right? And when I kind of applied that to security teams, one of the things I feel like is, in general, you'll never have enough security engineers. You'll never have a big enough security team, right? I mean, it's the nature of the beast. It is a cost center. When times are good, I'm sure you'll have enough security teams. When times are not good, you'll have to do it with less, right? So it's always good to think about how you can kind of leverage non-security teams as force multipliers, right? So let me give you a few examples, right? So we spoke a little bit about the platform engineering team, whose goals are aligned with developer productivity. Security is part of productivity. So how do you do that to build security first? That's a great example. Another example I was thinking about is that while security incident response is kind of not exactly the same as incident response, most companies have some way of managing outages, right? Not attacks, not like security related incidents, but just incidents in general, right? And they usually come up with some kind of a protocol on how to handle them. So when you're actually building a security incident management program, you don't have to start from scratch. In fact, you're much better off kind of leveraging what protocols they already have, figure out where it doesn't work for security, and maybe have like a little deviation there. So let me give you an example, right? So when an incident happens, you usually want to bring in the entire team together. You got to have a communication protocol, and once they're there, you want to have an RCA at the end of it. All these aspects remain exactly the same, even if it's a security incident. The only thing that may change is that you may not want to advertise on a public Slack channel that there's been a security incident, right? So you may have to change the protocol saying, hey, typically we tag these teams and we do this on these public channels. But if it's a security incident, maybe use a different Slack channel, which is limited in exposure, right? But you're better off starting with what you have than starting from scratch and then answering questions on and creating a separate team and, not using scale, not, leveraging the existing teams to scale. So that's another example. The third example, which we thought was really interesting, is customer success teams or customer support teams. So essentially, one of the issues you have is that if you're a company who exposes APIs, for example, and then your customers routinely, let's say, use bad behavior and leak their keys in GitHub, let's say, and then there are a lot of third-party tools which give you access to saying, hey, X number of keys of your users have been leaked on GitHub, etc. Right? Now you got to go reach out to hundreds of customers or dozens of customers and tell them this has happened. And the security team is not very well suited to do this, but customer support teams are very good at this, right? They may not understand the nuances of leaked secrets and why that's important, but they know how to manage an update across multiple merchants at the same time. right? So leveraging their expertise and their protocols can actually really help. Another example is leveraging L&D teams, like learning and development teams, right? So if you want to roll out developer training for your entire company, then it may not be a bad idea to say, hey, what LMS, what learning management systems do they have? How do they kind of deal with incentives for people who finish trainings? How do they track attendance? How do they track feedback? All these things have nothing to do with security. They're just regular training hygiene. So if you can leverage existing systems, then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that was great. The only kind of caveat I would say is that if the L&D team in your company, for instance, is terrible, then maybe it's not a good idea to piggyback off them, right? So you got to make a judgment on saying, hey, is this a program that works well in your company, or at least better than what you can build? And if the answer is yes, then you should piggyback. If not, you're better off kind of building stuff on your own, right? So, an example is, for example, if let's say program management in your company is not handled very well, or if people don't believe in program management, but you need it for the security team, then you may have to build it from scratch. But if a really well-oiled machine of program management already exists, you can just piggyback off it.
Yeah, I like this a lot. I had previously thought about and heard from many people the effectiveness of partnering with platform engineering teams, but I hadn't thought as much about leveraging other teams and processes and standards in terms like incident response, customer success, learning management, stuff like that. So I thought that was really cool.
And the other thing I also truly believed in, I think I wrote about this in my blog as well, is that I think security teams can be force multipliers too, right? There are things that we do well which are non-security related always, right? So an example I like to give is then when Razorpay went out to colleges to hire, college graduates, we participated in that program because it's actually kind of cool to talk about cybersecurity to college students, right? So we were more than happy to kind of participate in certain initiatives where we can showcase security as a part of engineering, right? So I don't think you should always think of yourself as like a silo. One of the challenges of being a security professional is that there's a ceiling to how high you can grow in a company. So usually, the number of years you spend in a company is lower than average in technology. So what ends up happening is you end up jumping company from company, and you kind of sometimes divorce from company culture. But I truly believe that if you're in a company, you should be a part of the whole, as opposed to kind of being a silo, a siloed program or a siloed team.
Yeah, agreed. I like it. Yeah. So moving on, I'm curious in terms of getting security prioritized. So if you're in an environment that's very engineering focused, how do you think about getting security work prioritized?
Yeah, no, that's obviously, I mean, it can go in many different ways, right? And I think the number one thing is probably to have a little bit of empathy for the people you're talking to. Understand that while security is top priority for you, and maybe, and I was kind of lucky that I worked in a company where security was top priority for the leadership as well. It may not always be the case that for developers, security is top of mind, right? So you've got to work with them to make sure that you speak about the trade-offs between fixing a security bug and shipping new features, right? And how do you kind of integrate that into their life cycle? So I think for us, there were 2 or 3 different things, right? So let me start this way. So one of the big challenges you face when you're building a security program is you often introduce new ways of detecting vulnerabilities, right? So let's say the first time, let's say you run some grep across your entire GitHub account, you're bound to find hundreds, if not thousands of real bugs, right? Now, if you go and ask them to kind of fix everything because everything's P0, then that's a real problem, right? So one of the ways we kind of like to define it is to say that you have different SLAs for backlog or debt and what happens in the future, right? So once our tooling is mature and we have a low rate of false positive, the right rules are applied, and so on and so forth. Once you have confidence in your own program, what you do is you have 2 different sets of SLAs. One for new features which are coming up. There you have almost zero tolerance for P0. So if you find that a secret was checked in or a vulnerable code was checked in, then you block the PR, you force them to update before they push to production, right? So you have a lot less tolerance there. But on debt, you kind of figure out which ones are really, really important and maybe be a little aggressive to that. But for the remaining, for the remaining bugs or the remaining issues, instead of tying it purely to risk ranking, maybe tie it to their sprint cycle, right? So if a team is having like a really busy quarter and you kind of started this initiative in the middle of that quarter, maybe give them 4 to 5 months to kind of clear your backlog so that they get to zero over time, right? And engineering managers love these things. They love burn down charts. So if you tell them they were at 100 and they went down every month, they really like it, right? So that's a kind of a way to incentivize them, right? You can start displaying that in your engineering leadership dashboards, etc., to kind of make them feel good as well. And obviously, with their teams, you kind of run the risk of being out of sight, out of mind when you give like a 4-month timeline. Sometimes, for instance, they might say, "Hey, if there's 4 months to do it, I'll start at 3.5 months." Right, and that's kind of where like regular reporting and these burn down charts really help, because if everyone's going down this way and you're going down straight, then it's easy to call it out in meetings and stuff like that. So that's one approach, when you have bugs, when you're introducing a new program itself. Another thing to kind of think about is how you communicate with teams as well. Right, I sometimes I feel security kind of relies far too much on FUD to kind of scare people into action, which may be warranted sometimes. But I think that sometimes if you just can speak the language they understand, they kind of do a whole lot better, right? So for instance, call them bugs, not vulnerabilities, makes a big difference, right? Have very, very clearly defined risk ranking, right? So for instance, CVSS was something I absolutely find really hard to communicate with developers on what the difference between 9.1 and 7.9 is, or 8.3 and 8.7 is. It's just very, very unintuitive, right? So if your company has a high, medium, low structure, or a red, amber, green structure, or a P0, P1, P2 structure, just follow that. Right. So instead of actually kind of coming up with something custom, which I think, again, security teams, I feel like are kind of guilty of doing that quite often. Right. So I think that's something we should avoid. The other thing to think about is think about the whole bug pile you have, or the things of security things you want to implement, and figure out how this may feature in the product roadmap. So for instance, let's say there are a couple of things you can improve on auth, right? On authentication, something to do with, entropy of MFA, how you're resetting MFA credentials, the kind of capture using, so on and so forth. Now you could use the usual SLA approach to kind of get them fixed, but these are things which are hard to implement, right? If for instance, if you look at the product roadmap and if you realize that, hey, 6 months down the line they have an auth rewrite planned, then maybe you kind of think about compensatory controls for these kind of issues, and then work with them to incorporate security into the rewrite. Right. So that way, for a fact that in 6 to 9 months, you will have the best kind of authentication you need. But at the same time, they don't have to kind of go away from their roadmap to implement that. Right. So having a good understanding of what the product roadmap is and how some of the security wins can feature in that can actually help you, work with them on longer timelines. Right. And I think that in general, kind of taking a longer view of things and working with the teams, I find has worked better than kind of creating urgency when it's not needed.
Nice. Yeah, I like these things a lot. Having making the sort of burn down chart very visible so people can feel good as it goes down. And I especially like the idea of understanding product roadmap and thinking, well, this security initiative is great for security. It's going to be a medium to a high amount of work. Oh, in 1 or 2 quarters, that's the focus of this team. Okay, cool. Let's just do it then. So it's minimally disruptive. And it just kind of makes sense if they're like, well, we're already working on authentication. Cool. Here's another thing that we can scope. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'll add to that is that these are hard choices sometimes, because as a security person, you're like, well, what if something goes wrong in the 3 months that I decided to wait? I decided it's okay to take this up in Q3. And what if we have a Q2 incident in Q2, which exactly happened because of that one thing, right? And I think that's a thing that security teams really, really, it gave me sleepless nights, and I'm sure it gives a lot of security professionals sleepless nights. And you kind of want people to sign off on it and get exception approvals for it, and we invent all these fancy processes to kind of manage personal risk in a company. But I feel like if you can build an environment where you understand and the leadership understands that security is a journey, you're never going to be 100%, but you're going to think about implementing the right features. But in the meantime, you also think about how to counter real threats, even if they're imperfect. That's okay, right? I think having that kind of slightly long-term view sort of helps you, sleep better at night, I guess.
Agreed. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So something I heard a security leader friend of mine say once is, I'm going to paraphrase, something like, never let a good incident go to waste. So I was wondering if you could give an example perhaps of that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is one of those things which every security incident is a double-edged sword. Like things can go bad, and you want to recover quickly from it, and you don't want too much to go bad. But at the same time, it's always an opportunity to improve things, right? So, across my consulting experience and my experience as an operator at Razorpay, I've obviously seen customers and companies go through many incidents, right? And very often, good companies come off better at the end of incidents. They actually get better. Their security improves over time, and there's a lot more appreciation for what security teams do. Having said that, that only happens if the security teams, like you said, don't let the opportunity go to waste, right? So when you're responding to this incident, you don't worry about teachable moments, but once the incident is done, that's when you can activate a plan. So an example I'd like to give, I like to usually give is, again, in one of the many areas where I was involved, a dev accidentally checked in like a Docker container which had like a lot of PHP code into Docker Hub. Right now, this had a lot of IP about the company, and kudos to the developer. They came and reported to the security team of that company, and the security team realized that there were actually no downloads about that in the last 24 hours or whatever since it was uploaded. So in a way, there was no real harm done, right? But that was a fantastic opportunity, because what they did at that point is they ran static analysis, they ran semgrep across that repo, found a lot of the vulnerabilities that were there, and then used that opportunity to educate the people, saying, hey, one is IP loss, which would have happened if somebody had downloaded the repo. But you almost, most good companies assume that your code is public and your IP is elsewhere, and you're able to manage, even if the code is public. But they were vulnerabilities, right? So what would have happened if these vulnerabilities were exposed, right? Until now, it was always a theoretical exercise, but because this Docker container was public for some time, it would have been possible that there were like 100 downloads, and it could have ended up on the dark web, for example, right? And then people would have realized, like bad actors would have realized, that there's a bunch of vulnerabilities on it. So this kind of made it real, right? I kind of always believe in show don't tell. Not show don't tell in the way of dump your entire database and send them a copy of your secrets, but show don't tell in a way that it kind of explains to them clearly what can go wrong, right? So in this case, it was pretty easy to say, hey, look, this is why a static analysis program is important, right? Because code can leak accidentally, humans can make mistakes, and we can stop some mistakes, but we can't stop all of them. But even if they do, if you have a secure code and where there are no vulnerabilities, then the odds of being exploited go down dramatically, right? And using this, for example, to kind of roll out a static analysis program or build consensus for static analysis is a good idea. So that was an example, where we used a good incident for good, I guess. A bad incident for good.
Makes sense. Yeah, there's a difference between, well, in theory, the source code could leak, and in theory, an attacker could use that to do this, versus like 2 weeks ago, this happened, and yeah, like it's a real thing.
Yeah, one of the things we kind of I kind of like doing is that, again, it really depends on the culture of your company that you're working in. But I mean, if you have a culture where pointing fingers is not a thing, and you're able to learn from each other, one of the things I like doing is every time we find a pen test vulnerability, is to record a video of how it can be exploited, and then wait for the team to fix the vulnerability, and then use that to teach other teams, right? And make it very clear, saying, hey, we're not like pointing at the team and laughing at them, but we're actually saying, look, they worked with us to fix it, but if they hadn't, then this is what could have happened, right? And I think giving those as examples is actually a really good way of teaching people as well. But like I said, it's got to work in your company's cultures.
Totally. Yeah. If it can be done in
Yeah.
a blame-free way, I think it could be very powerful, because it goes from some, I don't know, standardized secure code training that's like, well, yeah, in this random imaginary oversimplified code snippet, I guess this thing, like, no, look, this is in our company, in the internal frameworks and languages and everything we use. Like, yeah, here's a real instance of it. It just makes it feel more real, I think.
Yeah, and another example I like to give was in another situation where I was involved with, they were like denial of service attacks happening every weekend for a while, And then one of the initiatives the company was driving was to have more and more API endpoints get onboarded to the API gateway, because for microservices it was kind of optional to be on the API gateway. They did if they have to, but sometimes they found reasons not to onboard themselves. And if you're an API which is published on the API gateway, things like rate limiting, auth and auth is a lot simpler to manage, right? And we knew that from a security perspective, but it was a bit of work to get onboarded, right? So when you have like denial of service attacks, it's very easy to go and say, hey, you can either be on call Saturday evening in the middle of your dinner with your family, or you could just onboard your API gateway to your API to the endpoint to the gateway, and that means that a lot of the incidents will be automatically taken care of, right? So this is real, like being on call over the weekend and missing out on family stuff is a real pain that developers feel. So if you can tie in security initiatives to that, it's a lot simpler to kind of improve security behavior.
Yeah, I don't mean this in like a critical way, but there is something I think very healthy about aligning the pain of a negative outcome to the person or team who can change it, versus like, oh, if I don't do this extra work, the security team has to work over the weekend. Like, I feel a little bit bad about it, but it's not me missing dinner with my family. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
So are we gonna?
No, I'm good.
Oh, okay. So kind of along the lines of getting engineering teams to sort of get buy-in to have like bigger security initiatives, I'm curious, like speaking with a number of different companies, inevitably there's ideas internally of like, oh, if we sort of re-architected how this worked, or if we did that, there's this massive security win in sort of security posture across many areas. But oftentimes that's a non-trivial amount of upfront work before you start getting the benefit. So I'm curious if you could share some ideas or maybe an example of getting that sort of stakeholder buy-in for like a non-trivial security initiative in terms of maybe impact on engineering time required to make it happen.
Yeah, so one of the things I saw in a few companies happen, especially after Log4j, was that you suddenly had the bar raised on saying, hey, we can't possibly have Docker containers with a bunch of insecure things installed on them, right? That was kind of it kind of became very real after that weekend of patching, right? After 96 hours on call nonstop, everybody started realizing that this is really important, right? And I saw a few companies who were trying to move away from saying, hey, you can deploy whatever Docker container you want, and as long as your scan comes clean, you're good to go, right? And the scan never comes clean because there are like 2,000 different vulnerabilities and you can never fix them anyway. So you kind of live with them for a really long time. So this is kind of modus operandi in many, many different companies, right? And I think after Log4j and SolarWinds and a lot of other, after these incidents, a lot of companies woke up to the reality that, hey, the only way to kind of manage something like this is to move to golden images, right? Where you force kind of teams to, pull from a list of approved images and then add their code on top of it. The security team or the DevOps team makes sure that the golden images are always secure and they're always have only approved stuff. And the application teams are responsible for whatever they install on top of it, right? And for that, you will use a container image scanner to kind of, and you're responsible only for those vulnerabilities. So net, this makes complete sense, right? This makes complete sense. Having said that, if you're a company with a few hundred microservices or a few hundred Docker containers in production, having all of those teams move, all of these teams move to a golden image thing, move the way they do pipelines, figure out unit testing, figure out integration testing is actually pretty rough, right? And I think this is one of those areas where understanding a little bit of how incentive works and how behavioral economics works can actually be very helpful, right? So one of the things I found a couple of companies do, right, and we discussed this internally between two different security teams, is that, again, you got to go, you have to do a lot of upfront work. And some of that is security work, which obviously we should do. Like, for example, figure out which container images work well and so on and so forth. But there was a few steps to this, right? So step one is you have to make sure that some of the heavy lifting is done by the security team and you don't let the developers make all the decisions. So for instance, first make a list of every container image in production and then put them into different buckets. Like how many of these are Alpine? There may be like 300 versions of Alpine, but just make a list of how many of them are Alpine, how many of them are CentOS, and so on and so forth, right? And what you'll realize is that the major distributions, you probably have like 5 or 6. Okay, and maybe the number is higher in some companies, but they're not proportional to the number of container images, right? They're a much smaller number. And then you say, hey, let's go ahead and kind of create golden images for each of these distributions, right? So maybe you have like 5 golden images. So when you do all this work and then go to teams and say, hey, here's where you are today and here's where you need to be, that's a lot simpler than just publishing 4 random golden images and forcing everyone to move there, right? So already you kind of, you give the impression to your engineering teams that, hey, we're doing some of the heavy lifting work and you just have to come along for the ride. Now, once you do that, the next way to tell them is to say, hey, when we scan your current container image, there are X number, and usually in 3 digits or 4 digits number of vulnerabilities that you have to fix. Or if you have like a CVSS score 9.2, which drops in the middle of the night, then you have to do the upgrade yourself, right? And every team will have to do it. On the other hand, if you actually move to the golden image, then you don't have to do this yourself. Most of the work will be done by us because you're actually using a published golden image, right? So when you were able to talk to them this way, it was a lot better argument than kind of saying, whatever, there's a high severity issues, you have to fix them right now, and so on and so forth. And when you kind of, once the initial heavy lifting is done, your actual dev productivity goes up because you don't have to deal with so many vulnerabilities on a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis, right? So that was actually very interesting. So I think in general, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that you can tie this to audits or compliance requirements. Right? People generally hate being in audits, and you can count me in on one of them, right? And the best way to kind of not get in audit calls, or not seek exceptions, or not respond to audit findings is to kind of preempt how what some of these audit requirements might be and actually prepare for it. So one of the things we always use is saying, hey, if you use these container images, then you don't have to worry about audits because the golden images are quote unquote audit proof, right? So it gives me this work, right? So I think in general, I think the points we'd like to make was, if you don't move to the golden images, you may have a week like this sometime in the future where you have to do a lot of patching. And then that week might come every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months. Or you could spend 2 weeks now in a sprint, maybe in the next 3 months, where you do all the heavy lifting and then you have a much more predictable path in the future, right? In general, security is filled with a lot of known unknowns. So wherever you can convert those known unknowns into known knowns, just saying, hey, you can spend anywhere between 2 and 7 weeks for the rest of the year doing this, or you can spend 4 weeks now and almost no time later. I found that that's usually a sellable idea to development teams. Sorry if I rambled a bit there.
Yeah, agreed. I like that. Would you like to do an indeterminate amount of work at an unknown frequency, potentially a lot forever, or would you like to do some upfront work to just never have to deal with this again, at least to the most extent? I think that's a compelling argument. So to start wrapping this up, I'm curious if there's a few lessons learned from your time across consulting, Razorpay, and so forth that especially stick out to you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are many lessons learned, right? But I think 2 usually kind of always, stuck out to me when you're internal security team or you're working with internal security team. One is that it's really every time we did something custom and special, we struggled. But every time we integrated with what exists, we did a better job, right? And dev enablement is kind of a buzzwordy thing now, but that's actually, it's one of those buzzwords which actually is true, right? So for instance, everybody loves Defect Dojo. The security community loves it. They do a fantastic job of helping you do vulnerability management. But the reality is that when we kind of use Defect Dojo internally, devs never wanted to log into it, right? But when we added like an export feature in Defect, so Defect Dojo was used by the security team, like a version of Defect Dojo. But when you added Jira integration and moved the bugs that devs care about to Jira, then they suddenly cared about it because Jira is where they look at for all their bugs, including security bugs, right? So it was a lot easier for them to fix the same security bugs in Jira, which was actually suboptimal for security because it's harder to triage. You don't have all the related security information. Versus Defect Dojo, which was probably a better tool to track security vulnerabilities, but was not something that developers were familiar with, right? So in general, be where the developers are. Another example of that is business intelligence tool, right? Like I said, at least I personally was a big fan of kind of using metrics as a way to influence behavior, right? But it's also important to be where metrics is usually looked at, right? So for instance, if your company has an instance of Tableau or Looker or Power BI, then you want to publish security metrics there, right? If your company has a habit of writing weekly updates to as emails to your engineering leadership, then the most important action items needs to be there, right? So you've got to go where people look at things and not create your own security dashboard and you expect everybody to log into that portal and then kind of look for information, right? And I kind of made that mistake in Razorpay when I started, by the way. I created security, like an internal security portal, but I expected, and I made it like a one-stop shop for security and realized that nobody outside the security team ever used it, right? So that's something, that's a lesson that I learned. The next lesson I learned, which I think was very counterintuitive, is that in general, we have the saying that people, process, and technology, all three are really important in security, and that's true. They are important, right? But process is great, but tech is ultimate, right? So, for instance, there were a lot of things that I tried to solve using security champions programs, which, by the way, in theory, I absolutely love, right? I absolutely love building security champions program. I think it's a great idea, and I think we should do it regardless of how well it works. But the reality of security champions program is that it's kind of easy to start, but very hard to scale. More than hard to scale, I would say it's very fragile, right? So, for example, when organizations change, when you have these 4 fantastic security champions, but then they move to another team. And now there are 2 security champions in one team and 4 teams have no champions, right? Now you've got to go back to the drawing board and do the selling all over again, right? So that's a lot harder, right? Whereas if you solve a problem using technology, then it's a lot easier to scale across the company, right? So the one lesson I learned is that every time you have a problem that you want to solve, think about what technology can be used to solve it. And only if it's not feasible or too expensive or you're unable to solve it using technology, only then try and move to the process and the people aspect of things, right? That's very counterintuitive because I really, really felt like people, process, and technology were like equal partners in security. But over time, I just felt like the only way to scale is tech.
Yeah, that's a good point. People can switch teams. People can leave the company because they decide to go to new opportunities. And you're like, I spent 2 years investing in you, which is totally fine, right? Like people go on to advance their career. Yeah, that makes sense. So, Sandesh, this has been super fun. Thanks so much for sharing so many insights. So one last thing, I'm curious, could you tell us more about what you're up to right now?
Yeah. So last October, about 10 months ago, I kind of left my amazing job at Razorpay to kind of build something in security. And I'm now the co-founder and CEO of Seezo. Seezo is a AI first application security company. We're trying to solve a lot of problems that we faced as operators, right? Many of our ideas on what to solve were basically like OKR items in my previous job, which I didn't solve then, but I'm going out and trying to solve now, right? And kind of our hypothesis at Seezo is that application security, after all these years of so much effort by the entire industry, still has so many manual steps, right? So you can talk about threat modeling, vulnerability management, pen testing, triaging vulnerabilities, writing custom rules. There's just so many security AppSec activities which are manual, which have to be done by highly qualified application security engineers, right? And an often quoted statistic in the AppSec world is that for every 100 engineers in a company, you have anywhere between 1 and 3 AppSec engineers, right? And given how heterogeneous development teams can be, the only way to scale AppSec is to kind of almost like throw people at the problem, which is not possible, or use things like security champions program, which I just mentioned, right? Easy to start, but hard to scale. So we've kind of been thinking about how we can leverage Gen AI to kind of solve some of these problems, right? And one of the first products we're trying to we've built already is to automate security design reviews for application security teams, right? So in many ways, threat modeling, security design reviews, these things have remained the same for the last, 15 years, ever since I was in security, right? I remember we watched a video from 2012, I think, on threat modeling, and they outlined why threat modeling is hard to scale. And I kind of felt like in 2024, almost all of them are real, right? None of it has changed. Whereas if you think about something like static code analysis, which you are very familiar with, from where we were in the IBM AppScan days to where we are in the SemGrep days, there's a sea change of difference, right? But that evolution hasn't happened with security design reviews, and we kind of almost want to have security design reviews to have like a SemGrep or a sneak moment, depending on what tool you kind of prefer, right? And the idea is that every new feature that's built by a developer, which has a tech spec or a Jira epic or a design document or an HLD, all of these features should go through a design review, and the developers should get contextual early feedback on security. And the goal is that if they get that, then the odds of them making mistakes down the line go down over time. And plus, you as a security team, you get context about what can go wrong through the life cycle. So that can inform your code reviews, that can inform your manual pen tests, that can inform a whole lot of other things, right? So that's kind of what we're building right now. We're obviously very excited about doing this. We're a startup, we're a small team, but we've had some promising, we've had some promising feedback from customers, and we look forward to building this even more.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think, when I was a consultant at NCC Group, there were a number of the clients who were specifically having trouble scaling threat modeling. And I mean, if you could totally automate it, that would be great. But even providing feedback in terms of these epics or these design docs seem like they probably need a human to look at them. I think even the like visibility at scale is, even if it's not like totally doing it autonomously itself. How do you have a million, things that dev teams are building at any one point in time?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And the other aspect we realize is that one of the reasons it's so hard to scale threat modeling or security design reviews is because the input is non-deterministic, right? And most security tooling is built on deterministic input. It can be code, it can be HTTP traffic, it can be a list of vulnerabilities. These are things which are easy to parse through. And things like threat modeling, for example, require you to understand non-deterministic inputs like text and images, right? And even if you can just use Gen AI to kind of translate that non-deterministic mess into something that's easy to digest by tools, that itself is a big win, like you said, right? Like you said, if you can just risk rank every feature and say, hey, these are things that it needs a manual review. These are things that needs we've already done an automated review, but just do a spot check. And these are things which are very low in risk. So the developers can have a list of requirements, but if it's good if they implement them, if they don't, it's fine too, right? So even just that can add like a lot of value, and can also and I kind of feel like, and we're very excited about this because we feel like there's a lot of other use cases as well where generative AI can help AppSec. I know you've thought a lot about this as well and spoken about it. So yeah, so we're excited to kind of build interesting solutions.
Definitely. Well, I'm excited to see where it goes. So definitely keep us in the loop on that. So thanks again for your time. If people want to follow what you're up to, where would be the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, so I've been very active on LinkedIn. So I guess LinkedIn's a good place to look me up. You can search my name and you'll find it there. And I'm also sort of active on Twitter, but I think I talk more about cricket and Bangalore politics than I do about security there. So if you're interested in that, you should follow me on Twitter, or you can send me an email. I'm at Sandesh@Seezo.ai.
Cool. Well, sounds great. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening. And Sandesh, thanks for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.